So this lesson you're going to go back and forth between radical form and exponent form. So a radical is just a rational exponent. So rational exponents are decimals that stop or repeat. So instead of writing 64 to the 1/3 power, this denominator actually represents the index. So it's a cube root of 64, which is 4. And then 7/2 times 7/2, use the properties of exponents. It has the same base, so you can add the exponents. So 1/2 plus 1/2 is 1. So this is just 7. Now recognize that this is the same thing as doing the square root of 7 times the square root of 7, which is 7. Because this would be your index, your root. And the square root is, we don't really write a 2 right here. And then 5/3 times 25, 5 to the 1/3 power times 25 to the 1/3 power. Okay, without a calculator, what I'm going to do is I'm going to write this as the cube root of 5 and this as the cube root of 25. They both have the same index, so I can write this as the cube root of 5 times 25, which is 125. So the cube root of 125 is 5. So be able to go back and forth with radicals and exponents. So this is important right here is your numerator is going to be the power and your denominator is going to be the root. Now you can write it as doing a to the m first and then doing the nth root, or you can write it as the nth root of a and then take that to the mth power. So the order doesn't matter right here. So write the exponential expressions. Write the exponential expressions in radical form. So I'm going to write x to the 2/7 as a radical. So it's going to be the 7th root of x squared, or you can also write it as the 7th root of x and then square it all. These are the same things. Now if you see a decimal, write the decimal as a fraction. So -4/10 is the same thing as -2/5. So remember with negative exponents, you change, if the expression's in the numerator, you change it to the denominator. So this is actually going to be 1 over y to the 0.4 power. And we know that 0.4 is 4/10 or 2/5. So I write it as 1 over y to the 2/5. Now I'm going to write this as a radical expression. So this is going to be 1 over the 5th root of y squared. Or you could write it as 1 over y squared and the 5th root of that. Same thing. So if you have a decimal, write it as a fraction. And then over here, I'm going to write it as an exponent. So this is my denominator of my exponent, and 3 is the numerator. So it's c to the 3/4. This is my denominator, and my numerator is 5. So be comfortable going back and forth. So use the properties of exponents and with rational exponents. So what I do is I write this as the cube root of -27 squared. So there's two ways that you can look at this. You can think of squaring -27 and taking the cube root of it, or you can think of taking the cube root of -27 and squaring it. So what I do is I think of which one is easier to do. Is it easier to square -27 and then take the cube root of it? That's going to give you a huge number that you have to take the cube root of. Or is it easy to take the cube root of -27 and then square that number. I think the red part is easier because the cube root of negative 27 is negative 3, and I'm going to square it. Notice how I wrote that in parentheses because negative 3 squared is 9, so the answer is 9. For one like this, I'm going to write it as a fraction. So 25 to the negative 2.5 is 2.5. 2.5 is 5/2. So I'm going to write, this is a negative exponent, so I write 1 over 25 to the 5/2. Now I'm going to think of this as a radical as 1 over the square root of 25 to the 5th power. So you can either take 25 to the 5th power and then take the square root of that, or you can take the square root of 25 and take that to the 5th power. I think it's easier to take the square root of 25, which is 5, and take that to the 5th power. So it's 625. 1 over 625. C, again, I'm going to write it as a fraction. Now it has a negative exponent. Now I'm going to write it as a radical. So the 4th root of 81 is 3, so the answer is 1/3. And then 64 to the 2/3. So I write it as, you can write it as the cube root of 64 squared, or you can write it as 64 squared and then take the cube root of that. So I think that 64 squared is difficult to do and then to cube that, so I think it's easier to do the cube root of 64, which is 4, and then square it to get 16. And then over here I can either do the 5th root of negative 32 and then take it to the 4th power, or I can do negative 32 to the 4th power and then take the cube root of that. So again, I think it's difficult to do negative 32 to the 4th power and then take the 5th root of it. I think it's easier to do the 5th root of negative 32, which is negative 5, and then take that to the 4th power, which is 16. And then down here. So these parentheses means that each of these inside here need to be taken to the 2/5 power. So I'm going to have 243 to the 2/5 power, and A, but now I'm going to multiply this, is going to be negative 20 over 5, which is negative 4. So then do properties of exponents and reducing radicals, or simplifying radicals. This is the 5th root of 243 squared. The 5th root of 243 is 3. 3 squared is 9, so 9 is going to go in your numerator, and this is a negative exponent, so it's going to go in the denominator and be positive. And then B, again, I'm going to distribute this, so it's going to be 8 to the 1/3 times x to the 15 over 1 times 1/3 is 5. So I'm going to rewrite 8 to the 1/3 as the cube root of 8. So the cube root of 8 is 2. So the answer is 2x to the 5th power.